Good afternoon, and thank you for sticking around. I think the bar's still open. My name is Simon Rogers. I'm data editor at the Google News Lab. Like perhaps many of you, I have a job where my parents really don't understand what I do day to day. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about data journalism and what I do with data, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for questions too. So I'm going to start off with, this is me when I was age 7, and at that time there were many things that I liked. I kind of wanted to be a fighter pilot. I liked writing a lot. I liked taking things apart. I would often take stuff apart in my house. Our house was littered with broken clocks and radios and stuff. But the one thing I did not enjoy in my life was maths. You can tell I'm English at this point. Math, and I did try hard. In fact, my teacher at school said this about me and my math skills: tries hard, but has little natural ability, which actually I found to be quite a good kind of career planning tool. So somehow, despite this lack of natural ability in the mathematic kind of field, I had this weird career where I worked at The Guardian. I started in '98. It was actually the first news editor on The Guardian's website. We launched this thing called Guardian Unlimited. See how plain and simple it is. I kind of like it actually now. It had these little blocks for each subject. The news went to a news site and so on. And I was there for a little while. And in fact, I worked on the news desk. My first day on the news desk was actually September the 10th, 2001. And in fact, I was the only news editor on duty when the planes hit the towers. So I was there as a news editor for a while, but I set up this thing called the Guardian Data Blog. And the Guardian Data Blog was the first ever data news website. There hadn't really been one by a major news outlet before that. So somehow, having gone from kind of not understanding maths to setting up a data blog, there's a book called Facts Are Sacred, which is still out there. You can still get it. And then I came to San Francisco. I came to work for Twitter. I was the first data editor at Twitter, and now work at the Google News Lab. And so what is the Google News Lab? Google News Lab is kind of an editorial bridge between Google and the news industry. We're a global team. We work all over the world, and really our job is to kind of help the news industry tell stories. We're an editorial team. We focus really on things like partnerships and training. We have team members who go out into newsrooms, train hundreds of thousands of journalists every year. And we also work around the area of editorial innovation in the newsroom. And that's where my area fits in, where data journalism fits into that mission of supporting the news ecosystem. I do often get asked this, which is, why does Google employ a data journalist? And I think to kind of understand that a bit, I need to talk about how I got into this field and talk a little bit about how I understand what data journalism is now and how people are using numbers to tell stories every day around the world in new and kind of exciting ways, and how that might work. So when I grew up, this is how we consumed the news. It wasn't online, it was on paper. We were a newspaper house, and in the UK that meant we got The Guardian from Monday through to Saturday, and The Observer on Sundays, which is the world's oldest weekly newspaper. So I kind of grew up surrounded by paper. There was always paper all over the floor in our house, and our fingers were always kind of mucky from ink print. But at the same time, I kind of grew up with amazing writers and illustrators. Anybody know this guy? Richard Scarry. Anybody who hasn't read these books to their kids, you should do that. Amazing writer. A lot of books around people's lives and the jobs that people do. And so that's a newspaper editor, which looks kind of quite a cool, although slightly grumpy job. Being a reporter looks better, though. You get to run around with a smile on your face with a big carrot pen. So I kind of grew up wanting to live in that Richard Scarry world. But the other thing that Richard Scarry did very well is he would explain how things work all the time. So you'd have the drawings like this. This is the inside of a cruise ship. And it's like cartoony, and you think, well, this is a kid's book, right? The thing about those books is they're incredibly accurate. They explain how things work, and in a very human style that everybody can understand. And there's a reason why he does it that way. He wants people to understand the way that the world works and understand it in a kind of way that makes sense to them and they remember. So I've worked a little bit with kids' books. I did these books, which you can get now, and they're really about kind of how the world works through numbers and through data. And when I explain to my kids what I do, most of the time they kind of say, yes, Dad. But the one thing, when I did these books, they really understood it. And I think part of that is because the world out there is very nuanced and very grey. There's kind of a lot of uncertainty and craziness, as we know, going on. And facts and data can provide a kind of a bedrock of understanding. It can help us understand the world better. We understand the world in pictures way before we learn to read. And that's an incredibly powerful thing. And just because something's aimed at children doesn't make it less powerful. In fact, that's how we all learn to understand the world. And sometimes those images can have incredible impacts. Maybe some of you have seen this before. This was, essentially it's an infographic showing how many people could be fitted onto a slave ship, which became an incredible tool for people who wanted to abolish slavery. It was a really powerful visual way of representing data, albeit data that is incredibly difficult for people to maybe realize. So sometimes a picture can change the world. Sometimes data and numbers can change how it works. So I'm going to take us back in time a little bit. We're going to go back to May 1821. And this is the first news page of the first ever Guardian. And in those days, it was the first page was basically one piece of paper folded over. And the front page was essentially covered in adverts because, valuable retail space. Obviously, that's changed a little bit now. And the back page was covered in news. So while the front page was labeled things like a missing black Labrador dog, on the back you had all these news stories. And there, bang in the middle of the page, the first ever news page, the first ever Guardian, was a table of data, a table of numbers. And those numbers now would be relatively uncontroversial, right? There were lists of schools in Manchester, how many kids went to each school, how much money was spent on them, and so on. Now we would have that data. In 1821, it was 60 years before education was compulsory in the UK. Most kids, unless your parents were rich, they went to learn to read and write on Sundays at Sunday school, and during the week they went out to work. They earned their keep. So this data was incredibly political, and the official data was bad because nobody had the motivation to compile good official data. So that data was actually leaked to The Guardian as the first leaked data set. And the person who leaked it said this, and I'm not going to read it out, it's long and kind of slightly Victorian-y, but I take that to mean that unless we understand the world a bit better, then nothing is going to change. We can't change the world unless we understand it. And data can help us do that. So now we live in a time when kind of data and journalism have come together. And in the past, maybe, data was the province of people who had the skills. And now it's the province of people often working on their own in newsrooms everywhere who are trying to get people to understand it out there in the world. So there are some things that I've noticed about data journalism now that I want to kind of relate to you, and I'll talk about it. There's some kind of rules almost in a way. But the first rule is there are no rules. Anybody can do it. This is an incredibly powering thing. When I started working with data and visualizations, if you wanted to make a map of election results, you would have to go and really talk nicely to graphics editor, then create something in Flash, and every kind of bit of the country would be hand-coded. And that's changed, and there are a number of reasons for that. So in the past, there's been this movement where really we can look at something like this. This is actually from a punk fanzine from 1976 called Sniffing Glue. And this is a call, this is another, this is a third, now form a band. It's a great kind of theory of music, but not just of music, but also for life and for data journalism, where you have data sets that are plentifully available now. And we've got tools that we have there now that anybody can use. Anybody can start this and get into this. And that's an incredibly empowering thing, just for a reporter in a newsroom or anywhere, to be able to kind of get into being a data journalist. And part of this is reflected in the way that data journalism has become incredibly mainstream. We did a survey on the Newsland. We found that 51% of all newsrooms now have a dedicated data journalist. That figure goes up when you look at global digital newsrooms. And one of the things that I do is I'm director of these awards called the Data Journalism Awards. And this year we had a record number of entries, but it wasn't just that we had 630 entries. Half of them were from tiny newsrooms, loads of them were 57 countries. They're from around the world. We had entries from Afghanistan and Egypt and Uganda and Kenya. It's kind of an amazing flourishing of something that's happening out there in the world. And that work is incredibly powerful. And whilst you have the Wall Street Journal, you have the New York Times, the BBC, it's happening in Serbia and Peru and Ukraine and Brazil. It's an incredibly powerful thing. So part of that, why is that happening? Why is this happening now? And one of the reasons is that the tools that we have access to are getting better. A few years ago, this would have been the kind of the peak of online data visualization that we would all be able to do. I had to actually explain who this person was to some people earlier. I don't know, is this okay? Right. Whereas now you can make incredible visualizations just with free tools. This is something I made showing tweets of people about the sunrise as the sun's coming up. And I made it on a tool called Carto, which is a free tool that anybody can use. That's an incredibly powerful thing. Yet at the same time, a lot of data journalists do not feel like they're kind of part of this big movement. They feel quite isolated. If you were a Metro editor on a big newspaper and you left, everybody would know how to replace you because everybody knows what their skills are. If you're the data editor and you leave, nobody knows how to replace you because nobody knows who the skills are. We're trying to help that a little bit. There's this book which comes online called the Data Journalism Handbook, and we've made that, we're republishing a new version. This last published in 2011. There'll be a new one out later on this year. And partly that's just to make people realize that they're part of this community. They're not working on their own. But also another interesting part of this is that you don't have to be a coder or a developer to make interesting visuals. There's loads of tools out there now that can help you do that. This is something called Flourish. Flourish was built by a couple of developers in the UK, and what it allows people to do is your developer can upload their visualization into Flourish, and then somebody like a non-coder like me can then go in, add new data, change settings, change headings, and create a whole new kind of visual. There's new templates being added to this every day, and it's entirely kind of run by the community, which is an incredibly powerful thing. Because a lot of the work that people need to do, actually you don't want to spend hours kind of, just repeating the same thing again and again. Same thing like this, we may have seen these kind of maps. These are choropleths, maps that don't really look like maps, really good for showing small and tiny places. So we've noticed a real rise in these, and we've also heard anecdotally that a lot of famous kind of news outlets actually make these in Illustrator because there's no tool to make a choropleth. So we hacked this together in GitHub. It's a free tool to make choropleths. You can upload your own boundaries, you can move the map around and then download it and then use it as an interactive or as just a static visualization. So that's incredibly powerful to be able to kind of build these tools that then anybody can use. Another thing we've really noticed is that the size of the data that we have access to is just ballooning and changing all the time. A few years ago, we didn't have access to these data sets. Suddenly, all the exhaust of modern day life, from our phone calls to our tweets to our posts, this is data, and this is data that tells us something about who we are and the way that we work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that I work with and explain how that works a bit and give you a sense of it. A lot of data that I work with is Google Trends. You may see or have heard about Google Trends. There's a website, trends.google.com. It's free to use. I would argue it's actually the world's biggest journalistic data set. It's public, it's open, everything is downloadable. We try and make it as transparent as possible. I think partly because we have a responsibility to do that, because search data tells you some interesting things. The size of it is obviously the first, biggest, most obvious thing. There are billions of searches every single day. It takes you beyond the echo chamber of social media into this kind of ubiquity of search. I made this map really just showing towns that have access to Google search data. So we have Google Trends data at a global level, at a national level, it goes regional, right down to city level. Can't go any lower than that. I can't tell you what your mum has searched for or anything like that. But this is kind of like a global atlas of search, if you like. There are some places, obviously, where we don't have data. Partly it's because either Google's not available or people don't live there. But you can see how it kind of reflects boundaries and reflects the way that we live as humans, just through the way that we search, because it's so much a part of our lives every single day. And there's also a kind of honesty to the way we search. you're never as honest as you are with your search engine, and that's great because it's not about how you're presenting yourself. When we try and represent search data, it's often about just who you actually are, what you really care about. And sometimes some of that stuff is kind of a bit light, but it tells us a lot. This is a map showing searches of donuts versus searches of croissant. I want to guess which color represents which one. Please tell me everybody knows that, otherwise I'll have to say. But we also try and work with other data too, which represents, again, the kind of the way that we live. We put this piece together, which was based on visit data, so where you actually go rather than just where you're searching for, looking at the way that we eat. What kind of restaurants do we go to? And you kind of get these very different maps of America based on our food consumption. Food tells you everything you need to know about who we are as people and the kinds of food we like, whether it's pizza or sandwich bars or coffee bars or Mexican or Italian food and so on. And sometimes there's a reaction around events. This is something we did around the World Cup. It was a live kind of updating top searched players from game to game. This is worldwide, and then that was England, I think. And you can see it's actually the same player because it kind of shows you how people are following that game. And obviously, at a kind of more serious level, there's an immediacy to the data as well. And that immediacy can show how a story can travel around the world faster than you might think possible. This was something we did after the Paris attacks. We wanted to look at how long it took that story to spread. And it was minutes that people are searching in Sydney and Tokyo and around the world because we want to find out what's going on. I take this, even though this is about a really tragic event, it makes me feel slightly optimistic because we want to find out what's going on. People go to search because they want to know what the truth is behind something. They're not just going to accept what they're being told or what they're seeing. As we know, a lie can be halfway around the world before the truth's got its boots on, as Mark Twain said. This, at least now, we have the power to find out for ourselves what's going on. Of course, there's one time where we need to know what's going on almost more than any other time. It's vitally important, and it's around elections. We do a lot of work around elections, and partly that's because Google Trends data has only been available as a real-time data source for the last 2 years. So we've only really had it since just before the 2016 election. And it's allowed us to tell really interesting stories, and partly it's given us a new way to kind of see the world. People often say to me, it's just a search, right? It's just a search. But it's more than that. A search is a really powerful social indicator of what we feel about things and how, and nowhere is that more true than elections. Sometimes we find weird stuff that just shows up out of nowhere. And you can do all this really sophisticated stuff, and I'll show you some of it. But actually, you end up with stuff like this is what people remember. But it's not just that. And this has happened around the world. In Germany, we worked with an amazing designer called Moritz Stefano. And the idea was to open up this data. We published all this data sets publicly as well. And he reinvented the word cloud, which, if you're a designer, word clouds are kind of like the mullet of data visualization. So that was like a challenge for Moritz to find a beautiful new way to show word clouds. And these actually show related searches for each of the candidates in the German general election. And they would change day by day. And these are some really interesting work looking at the kinds of issues that people were searching for when they were searching for particular politicians. So this is kind of a global thing. So there's something else about data journalism which is very kind of interesting to the field if you work in journalism, because journalists are often quite kind of protective of their information, and that comes from a history of being, if you're a journalist, you are in your kind of ivory tower dispensing information to the grateful world which receives it and thinks you're wonderful for even deigning to give it to you. And what is interesting about data journalism is it encourages reporters to collaborate, to make their work better, and encourages you to involve the public in it. Whether it's something like this is the map I made a few years ago, and it showed poverty rates in London. And I first made this map on the left, and somebody tweeted out and said, this is a total fail, this map's awful. And my first reaction to that was, how dare you? The second reaction was, well, what would you do? And we ended up having this long debate around color scales of map. Just out of interest, anybody know why that first map on the top left is bad? Somebody said color blindness? Yeah. Really bad. So I thought it was great, but apparently not. So my work was made better by the fact that we could engage with the community and talk to people out there about what they know. One of the results of this is a project called Electionland, which we did in 2016, and we're going to be doing again next Tuesday. And this is where Electionland 2016 was actually the biggest single-day journalistic collaborative project ever. And basically, it involved just over 1,000 reporters looking at, in real time, looking at election issues. Sort of things that stop people voting on election day, long lines, broken machines, and so on. We're going to be doing this again. We're also going to include people searching for just how to vote, how to find their polling place, because that might give us really interesting indications of where kind of enthusiasm is highest. Another project which we're really proud to have worked on is called Documenting Hate. And what that does is try to bring together actual data around reporting of hate crimes. Because, or even though this is a huge issue, as we know from our recent past, there's no good national data in the US on hate crimes. It's reported by some states, not reported by other states. So what Documenting Hate does is try and bring data to that. And partly it's looking for stories, and there are tip-off lines where people can share stories and so on. But there's also, we wanted to kind of use the best data set we had to support that. So what we did was we took the Google News corpus, which is millions of stories, and as you know, if you go to Google News, most of the stories you see are going to be from trusted sources, those big outlets. And what we wanted to do was actually get the little outlets. We wanted the news outlet in the Midwest that nobody's going to find. So we brought those stories together, and then we used the Google Cloud Natural Language Processing API to categorize and read all those stories for us to see what they're about, what places are they about, what people are they about. And partly we wanted to do that to show journalistically, this is a kind of proof of concept. How can you use machine learning in journalism to help tell a story? And partly we wanted to provide a kind of tip-off service for reporters so they could use this to find stories they might not have heard about, and then that might lead to those stories getting aired and getting broader coverage. So another important part about data journalism is how open and transparent it is. As I said in the past, journalists like to kind of hold stuff together, but this collaborative kind of vibe really means you've got to open up your data. And there are lots of people doing this around the globe. La Nación in Argentina, Convoca in Peru, this is Indiaspan, which they all take government data and then make it accessible and open to people. In some countries, it's dangerous to do that. There are some places where people get arrested for doing that. We have the Data Journalism Awards, one of the winners this year was Rappler. They've had journalists arrested in the Philippines, just for doing their job. So getting data open can be difficult and dangerous. So it's a real mission, and people have to really want to do it. And even in the US, there are all of these sites run by people like 538, HuffPost, and The Upshot, New York Times, and so on, where people go on GitHub and they'll publish their data every day. And we do that as well. We have a GitHub page. And part of the reason we did that was really because this is how people work, and we want people to find it super easy to download their data. There are other ways we could do it, other kind of more googly ways, but we thought this is actually where people are, so that's where we should be. So I'm going to talk a little bit about process, because how interesting is that? And I would say like 80% of the work you do as data journalists is pretty tedious, but it's that 20% that kind of makes up for it. So I actually did this when I was at The Guardian, and that's actually still how I work now. You kind of start off with, at the beginning of a story, thinking, what would be interesting about this? I've had people saying to me, do you just kind of like dive through the data? And I actually don't do that. I tend to start off, and maybe that's an exhibit of my biases, and I'm sure it is. But actually, if you want to find a story and not just find a needle in a haystack, it's good to have a direction, a general direction of travel. So often we'll start with, say, the breaking news story, or as we get a data set. There might be a theme that we want to explore, and so on. And then really you get into this world where, what do you want to do with it? And a lot of data scientists would look at the work data journalists do and probably kind of laugh hysterically, because a lot of it is very simple. You want to compare whether something's bigger than something else. How has it changed over time? And for me, part of the reason for doing that is actually you want to be able to explain those stories very clearly. People out there in the world often are kind of scared by numbers still. So I want to make sure everything we produce is really kind of obvious to people what we're doing and that they understand it. And then really that process of performing the calculations, data being in the wrong format, merge cells, all of that stuff. Data on PDFs. PDFs are where data goes to die. It's a kind of incredible thing that governments and people still publish data on PDFs. I was talking to a reporter in New Jersey yesterday, and they get data sets that are handwritten. Imagine getting handwritten data. It's kind of crazy. This is the stuff that people have to deal with. And at the end of it all is this output. And output is obviously a kind of very kind of computery term, but actually it kind of represents what you do as a data journalist. You can represent what you do in so many ways now, and visualizations, threads on Twitter, publishing a number, big analysis pieces. It can be anything. Then I'm going to talk about really quickly, because I can see the time ticking down, is how design matters. And I talked before a bit about how I grew up in a newspaper house. This is how people consume the news. But now increasingly, and this is from a Reuters survey recently, many markets are now at the tipping point where things are switching from paper, print, to digital and mobile. In many countries, it's become the norm. It's the norm almost certainly here very, very soon. And that affects where people understand the news as well. That 30% reading the news on the toilet, I think that's entirely accurate. But this is how we read now, how we consume. So all these visualizations, which become way more sophisticated, suddenly they don't work. And so one of the things we've tried to do is look at how we can produce visuals that work well on mobile. And we have this visual project. A lot of companies have data viz budgets. What we decided to do is use that budget for good, as it were. So what we do is we go to amazing designers, people like Giorgia Lupi there, and Alberto Cara and so on, and we work with those designers. We say to them, we want you to make what you want to make, and the only conditions we have is that it's open source so other people can use it, and that you're using the data in innovative ways, and that it's mobile first. So whether it's something like this, which is looking at the issues that people search for compared to candidates in countries around the world during the 2016 election. We did this visual around food with Moritz Safar in Germany, where he was trying to represent months and years on one chart, rather than having loads of little line charts. You've got these charts. It also has the advantage that some of them actually look like food, which was not something we expected, that you produce data that looks like food. But and sometimes that means we try and innovate in-house as well. So we made this visual about Brexit, looking at the questions that people are asking in different countries across Europe. And sometimes I talk about the food thing, and this is how Moritz tried to kind of make that work. But then when we made the Brexit one, we thought it'd be kind of cool to turn it into a VR visual because it's kind of 3D-ish. So we made our first VR visual. We did it in 2 weeks. It was a total hack. I learned so much about VR. Like, you can't present people with a ton of information because they can't absorb it. You have to give people somewhere to stand because otherwise they feel physically sick. It's actually possible to make people feel physically sick with a data viz. So these are lessons to learn. So when we do something like that, then we'll publish a kind of lesson. This is how we did this, how we put it together. We now have VR templates. This is something we made which lives on Flourish, so anybody can use it. You don't have to be a developer. It's really a network chart. So this particular one shows how people search for TV shows. If you search for Game of Thrones, what other TV shows you look for. But the idea was you could put any data in there. It could be how politicians connect around a financial scandal, or it could be any particular story. And now you can do it without being a coder. We just launched this, which is called Building Hope, which is really a test of doing data visualization in an AR environment, in an augmented reality environment on your phone. How would data represent itself? So we do stuff like this. We'll experiment, we'll put the code online, then people can remake it. But at the same time as all this stuff's getting more and more sophisticated, because of that move to mobile, visualizations are increasingly becoming simpler as well. At the same time, there's been a real rise in data GIFs, of people representing data in visuals that could be shared easily on mobile. This is something we've really noticed, and we built this tool called Data GIF Maker, which allows you to create very simple visualizations in GIFs. Make it really, really easy. This is actual real data, by the way, although it doesn't reflect my world. I can tell you that for nothing. So, and we're going to relaunch that later on this year with more visual types and more charts. At the same time, visualizations need to be human, they need to be fun, because you want people to understand what they're about, whether it's about the top words that people translate, search for how to translate into English in different languages, top one of which is beautiful, by the way, which makes you feel good about the world, or how to fix stuff, because this is how we search. We search how to fix stuff, but doing that in a kind of very human way, where you can see that in the US, we search for how to fix light bulbs and doors, and in France, they search for how to fix washing machines and toilets. So One of the things I wanted to say before I finish is how memory is a really important part of this. And although this still seems new, very exciting, there's a history there. So I don't know if anybody knows who this guy is. So this is an anaesthetist in London, a guy called John Snow. And John Snow worked in Soho in central London, where they'd had a big cholera outbreak. And he mapped those outbreaks. And that's how they discovered that cholera wasn't spread through some miasma in the air, but through dirty water. Florence Nightingale, lady with a lamp, also was a lover of statistics and wrote big reports about the conditions in the British Army, which showed that you were way more likely to die from a preventable disease than on active duty. These are there's a history there, and that history is really important because it teaches us stuff about how we can work in the future. So bearing that in mind, I'm going to end at this guy. This is James Cameron, who was not the James Cameron who directed Aliens and Avatar, I'm afraid. He was a British journalist in the 50s and 60s, and he was in Vietnam and Korea. Amazing storyteller. You can still find some of his reports now online. You can still see them on YouTube. He said, New World will be a place of answers and questions because the only questions left will be answered by computers, because only computers will know what to ask. And now we're in a place where we can do work that we could never do before because of the availability of cheap technology, and that's changed how we work and changed certainly how journalism exists and how journalism copes with numbers. But the core mission of what people do, if you're telling a story, if you're a journalist, is that mission to tell a story in the best possible way. That is the mission of journalism. It's also the mission of data journalism. So using numbers to do that is incredibly powerful, and it can change how we see the world. Thank you.